My name is George Butler. I was born on March the 4th, 1952. My parents were Jane and Jean Butler. They were born in Memphis, Tennessee, raised in Osceola, Arkansas. I went to college and law school here in Fayetteville, and after I got out of college, I wasn't sure where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do. After I passed the bar, I lived in Little Rock for a while, where I met and married my wife, Kathy, and I heard I was really wanting to move to Fayetteville. I loved Fayetteville, loved Northwest Arkansas. And there was a job opening, and I got it. I worked briefly for Lamar Pettis and Phyllis Johnson, and then I became a deputy prosecuting attorney under Marilyn Gibson, and then I'm continuing on with Kim Smith, and I did that full time for about 3 years.
So tell about your first job with Washington County and what you did working for those prosecutors. What was your job like? And tell me about your bosses.
Okay. Well, of course, I started out as a deputy prosecutor under Marilyn Gibson and then Kim Smith. And we prosecuted, felonies and misdemeanors of all different kinds. And I prosecuted or assisted prosecuting on Kim Smith on one big murder case we had here back then. Also prosecuted a guy who was over child pornography, and that was a big case. But if they were really big, court cases, the prosecuting attorney, Kim Smith, prosecuted them, and had one of us deputies assisting them. And so we just, did a run-of-the-mill felony cases and misdemeanor cases, felony cases in circuit court and the misdemeanor cases out in some of the Fayetteville, what were then municipal courts, Fayetteville Municipal Court, Prairie Grove Municipal Court, Springdale Municipal Court.
Tell me about the judges at that time. Who were the county judges or the circuit judges, and what were they like?
Maupin Cummins was circuit judge then, and I can remember, as all young lawyers, just being scared to death of him. And his bark was worse than his bite. But even going to Maupin did almost all the criminal cases, and Maupin had been on the bench for a long time. And just even going to an arraignment in front of Maupin Cummins, where you're a young lawyer, not almost fresh out of law school, you were intimidated, But you get over that, and then we had Paul Jameson came along, and he did some criminal cases too. And I guess Paul Jameson came after Maupin Cummins died. And he was colorful, not as colorful as Maupin Cummins. Maupin Cummins was very colorful, but he was colorful too. The prosecuting attorney then, as well as now, we also handled mental commitment cases, and still do. And of course, those cases were heard by Tom Butt and John Lineberger. And of course, Judge Butt was one who became, the oldest sitting. Well, we had a division between circuit court and chancery court, chancellors in the state of Arkansas, and we had to do the civil commitments in front of them. And they changed the law. There was a big wave that changed the laws on mental commitments back then, and it wasn't always easy to get somebody committed. They were both great judges, and Lineberger had been a former public defender. He sat on the bench for a long time. He was great to practice in front of, as were Tom Butt, Maupin Cummins, and Judge Jameson could be a little bit difficult at times, but you have to get used to your judges, and we did, and they were both fair. And
tell me about your prosecutors. First Marilyn, and then
Kim Smith. Right. Marilyn was serving out his last term. He'd already been elected to become circuit judge. Maybe he took Maupin's place. I have a hard time remembering that. Marilyn may have taken Maupin's. Maupin may have retired. So he was serving out his last term. Kim was the deputy. He'd been a deputy under Marilyn for several years, so it was really about kind of Kim was making his call. And so I worked a little while under Marilyn. I actually clerked for the prosecuting attorney while I was in law school. When Marilyn was prosecutor, I clerked. And they had us They threw us into municipal court and juvenile court, said, "You're on your own, boys." And it was scary. That was a little bit scary and intimidating at its time. Bob Mays was the juvenile judge, known as the juvenile referee at the time. And I can't remember who the Fayetteville Municipal Court judge was at the time. His name's on the tip of my tongue. But we did that as interns, and then we became deputies. We mainly would help do the low-level felons. And the prosecuting attorney back in those days, you took a lot of walk-in traffic. You didn't just have to call and make an appointment like you do nowadays, or have a law enforcement agency investigate it. We took a lot of walk-in complaints. You know, we had a form where they'd sign and we'd have them sign an affidavit. Then we maybe we decide whether to file charges or not. Maybe sometimes the deputies would confer with each other, or we would talk to the prosecutor, who would have been Kim Smith, about, is there enough to file here? And we took a lot of walk-in cases, and you got a lot of real interesting people coming in on just walk-in cases, wanting to file charges against somebody.
What are some of the cases that stand out in your memory?
I'm trying to think of the murder case that Andrew Zeiser was the deputy at the time also, and Kit Williams. And we had to retry some cases that Marilyn Gibson tried, big murder cases. One of them was Shirley Curry, who was guilty of a mass murder of family members after she lost a custody case in front of Judge Butt. And she had a list, and she was going around shooting people and marking them off her list. Judge Butt was on her list. She hadn't made it to his house yet. And I remember assisting on that. And then the other one would have been me and another deputy. Try to remember which one it was. We tried a case against a guy named Edward or Edwin Hoggard. It was a notorious child pornography case. Involved not child pornography and the molesting of a young boy, and all kinds of child pornography. And we tried that case in front of Judge Jameson. Those are the two that stick out in my mind the most. Another case is real interesting. I got it, Kim Smith gave it to me at the last minute. So here, you're gonna try this, haven't been able to work it out. And I looked, I said, oh my God. A lady by the name of Dorothy Buchanan lived back here behind the courthouse. Longtime Fayetteville resident, longtime Fayetteville African-American family, was robbed by a white guy. Long hair and a beard. And one of the problems we had was there were no eyewitnesses. It was just Dorothy's word against him. Dorothy Buchanan at that time used to sell beer on Sundays to help make ends meet. So he went by her house on Sunday, knew that she was open for business, that she would sell beer, and he robbed her. She made the absolute best witness I've ever seen. She was scared to death, and I was so worried about her. She was the fantastic. She made a great witness. She was so believable and so upset and so scared. And of course, the interesting thing was the defendant had an alibi, but he decided to take the stand. And Dorothy Buchanan had described this guy in detail, not only long hair and a beard, but he had tattoos all over his arms, which was not common back in those days. So I asked him to roll up his sleeves, and they were covered with tattoos. And he was convicted, and the jury gave him 18 years. And much to my surprise, we thought, Kib kind of ribbed me about it. I kind of ribbed him about giving me that case at the last minute and having to try. And we got, very surprising, a verdict. He went to prison for 18 years. And I remembered, I used to see Dorothy, she's no longer with us anymore. I'd see Dorothy Buchanan all the time. I always talk to her, and we'd reminisce about that case and whatnot. And that one probably sticks in my mind more than any of them.
What happened to make you decide to leave there, and what was next?
Well, I decided I'd been there for 3 years. It was time to leave and go out into private practice. And so there was another lawyer who was practicing here at the time, Richard Hipp. Richard moved away. He's not here now. Now he's retired out in Colorado. So I moved in. I went in to practice with him. Kim also needed we had some part-time deputies who handled what we called then municipal courts. Fayetteville Municipal Court, Prairie Grove, and others popped up, West Fork, Elkins. And so I was a part-time deputy, and I would prosecute out in those different night courts, Prairie Grove, Fayetteville Springdale were day courts, West Fork, Prairie Grove, and West Fork and Prairie Grove were night courts. And I would prosecute those cases. In fact, my wife was pregnant and I was out in court in Prairie Grove at night court, of course before cell phones or anything, and my mother-in-law was up here and she went into labor. So they had to contact me they had to contact via radio and then get word to us. We had to they radioed the sheriff's department, radioed the police department, who sent somebody over and said, your wife and mother-in-law said you need to come home. They've gone to the hospital. And so, but then the first county attorney, which was a part-time position, was Ginger Parker Crisp. And she was leaving to become counsel at the University of Arkansas. And they asked me, and it was the county judge then was Charles Johnson. He and Roger Haney and some members of the court asked if I would be willing to at least do it temporarily until they chose someone, because before we had a county attorney, the prosecutor, meaning the deputy prosecutors, handled civil cases for the county, and I handled a couple of civil cases for the county. So I said, didn't know that I was that much interested in, but I said, okay, I will, you know. And so I did, and I went to the quorum court meetings and drafted the ordinance and things. I said, well, okay, I think I might like to do this. So I got chosen by the quorum court. The quorum court would make the recommendation, the county judge would appoint them. I've forgotten who all applied for it. And so I became the part-time county attorney, county civil attorney for the county, handled all civil matters for the county, be it lawsuits, drafting ordinances, giving legal opinions to elected officials on a variety of matters. And I did that part-time up until, Jerry Hunton was elected, Charlie Johnson was in office, I think about 20 years. Jerry Hunton was elected in 1998, and in the year 2000, he wanted me to go full-time. The quorum court agreed to that, so I became, in I think it was year 2000, full-time county civil attorney. And I did that for 14 years. I retired at the end of 2014. Marilyn Edwards had been elected in 2008. Jerry Hunton retired, and Marilyn was elected, and of course she wanted me to stay on, and I did, but then I retired at the end of 2014, and a new county attorney had been selected, and her chief of staff resigned, and Marilyn was serving out her last term then. This was going to be her last, when she got elected again in 2014. She wasn't going to run again. And so she talked me into coming back. She said, I need somebody who knows county government, knows all the department heads, which I did, and also who knows that this job's got an end date, which it did. It ended in December of 2016. And so I did that from July of 2015 to the end of 2016. And then I was done. I was gone from the county after that.
Tell me about the different judges you worked for and what they were like, starting with Charlie Johnson.
Well, Charlie, I first worked for Charlie Johnson. Charlie was a very laid-back person, and very easy to work for, and his assistant Roger were too. We did have some battles during Charlie's tenure. First of all, the first thing we implemented was E911. I had to draw the ballot for that. That was voted on, but I had to draw the ballot for that. Draw up the proper ordinances, draw up the ballots for that, and that passed. But we had what was known then as the ambulance wars when Charlie Johnson was county judge, and it was a bitter battle between Central EMS and West Washington County EMS. Finally, when we implemented 911, Charlie made the decision, the quorum court agreed that we needed Central EMS to be the ambulance provider for the entire county. It was just being much more efficient, much more professional. Well, that sparked a lawsuit in state court, and it went up to the Supreme Court, and also in federal court. I can't remember if that went up to the 8th Circuit or not, but we won both of those cases. And that was the end of the ambulance wars under Charlie Johnson. Also under Charlie, when I first started being a practicing attorney, everybody, as you well know, everybody was a Democrat. There weren't any Republicans in Washington County to speak of. I think there may have been one or two on the quorum court. Well, the Republican Party started gaining traction in the state of Arkansas and all in Washington County, and trying to think, we had 13 JPs. It went from having almost all Democrats to 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans. And there were a couple of Democrats and a couple of Republicans on the quorum court who were constantly at each other's throat all the time, and it caused us untold headaches for the county judge. Of course, I was the county attorney, so I didn't take sides on political issues or even policy matters. I just weighed in on the legality or the constitutionality of them. But they all got off at the end of Charlie's term. And when Jerry Hunt was elected, that was what the Republicans took over a majority of the quorum court. There were 8 Republicans and 13 Democrats. But I'm here to tell you, our fights there were never, I don't think, any partisan fights. The Republicans, as well as the Democrats, fought amongst themselves, all the time, squabbled, Jerry was, because he came on as a Democratic county judge with a quorum court majority Democrat, he was able to bridge that divide very well. He was a consummate politician in that matter, in order to be able to bridge the divide between the Republicans and Democrats. And I don't remember any major party line decisions or issues back then.
Who are some of the quorum court members that you can remember that stand out? I mean, obviously you've got like Jessie Bryant.
Jessie, of course, Jessie. Jessie was on more than once. She was on the quorum court twice, I think. And Jessie was memorable. We had some, Lyle Thompson was on for a long time. Very colorful character, university professor. Once a year, always read a poem that he had composed. Wilson Kimbrough was on for a long time. He was the one who pushed the quorum court into adopting what we call the Job and Salary Administration Plan, which brought a level of professionalism into grading the different positions, the different jobs in the counties, their positions and what their salaries should be, because it was just kind of all over the map before that. There was no systematic way in determining, be it sheriff's employees or county clerk employees or treasurer employees, how much they were going to get paid. Trying to grade those positions in a nonpartisan, non-political, non-emotional manner. And it created what they call a JSAP committee, people would come in with their request for a position, and if they wanted them to be paid more than a certain amount, we had minimums and midpoints and things like that. We hired Johansson Consulting to consult us on that, and they could come in and make a request, and the committee would look at that request, turn to a professional to guide them on how they should handle these different salary requests. We actually had civil service in the county, and that got abolished. The legislature abolished the ability of the county to have civil service, and so we no longer had civil service.
Talk about Marilyn Edwards. You said you served as county attorney and then later
as chief of staff,
what was
right?
She like as a judge?
Well, everybody's different. Charlie, Jerry, and Democrat and Marilyn. Though they were all Democrats, they were all different. They had different styles. Marilyn was Marilyn could be a tough taskmaster. She could be. I mean, she knew what she wanted done, and she wanted it done in a professional manner. She was easy to work for. Don't get me wrong. I never had any problems working for Marilyn as county attorney or as her chief of staff. But she did know what she wanted and what she expected. She did turn to me for legal advice as county attorney, and then as chief of staff, she, would rely on me for advice. Particularly in terms of hiring. We had to hire several new personnel while she was in office, and So all of them were easy to work for. I found them all easy to work for, even though their personalities were different. They were all easy to work for. They took advice, legal advice without hesitation. When it was clear, on the legalities or constitutional things, there was never any question with any of them, what road they would go down. And then when it came to policy advice, of course, Marilyn was the county judge, so when it was policy involving any department under her, she called the shots, but she leaned on me, for advice, on that too. Sometimes she would take my advice and sometimes not, but they weren't legal matters. I wasn't the county judge, so I tried to stay out of the legal arena because we had a new county attorney then.
Tell me about the Amendment 59.
Okay, that came up.
What was the case and how did you get involved?
Well, Amendment 59, which had been known by the Supreme Court as the Godzilla of constitutional amendments, it was this long, complex amendment that had been adopted. It had to do with valuations or assessment of property in the county, both personal and real. And when they went up a certain amount, when you had to roll back your millage. There was a complex formula to do that. Well, Stu Phillips was the assessor and had been the assessor for a long time. And at the time, what they were doing back then, they would have to do reassessments periodically of real property. Personal property too was mainly real. And property values were starting to shoot up from 2000 on as Washington County grew tremendously. Property values were going through the roofs. Well, the Attorney General at that I think was Winston Bryant, had given an opinion, and all the assessors were following. They didn't assess the whole county at one time. They just assessed different portions of it at different times because it was too expensive and time consuming to do it all at one time. It took a long time to do it. You hired a reappraisal firm to help you with that. And they said, well, no, you don't have to roll back. Well, suddenly the Attorney General changed his position and said, well, no, I think you're going to have to wait on all those values and put them on at the same time, and then you might have to roll back. Well, that instigated a lawsuit. It wasn't just the county. The assessor for the county didn't just assess property for the county. The assessor, as most county officials, they perform services countywide. They assess property for the school districts, for the cities, for everybody, who all then levy their own millages. Well, it made a huge difference. And so all the school districts in the county, all the cities in the county, and the county all got sued because we had not rolled back our millage. Ultimately, as we went through the lawsuit, there were several lawyers involved, obviously. I was representing the county, and each of the school districts had their own attorney, and each of the cities had their own attorneys. Well, Benton County was also being sued over the same thing. It was a big class action. There were class action lawsuits. They went up on a temporary ruling on what we call an interlocutory appeal. And the Supreme Court made a ruling, and I'm trying to remember, we thought we were safe from all previous years, as I recall, except for the year we were challenged in. But the Supreme Court, based on either case law or AG opinions, the Supreme Court came and said, well, not necessarily so. In other words, you're open for all these back years, counties, school districts, and cities. Well, Jerry and I talked about it, and we decided, we maybe need to settle this thing, which would mean rolling back our millage and then refunding, maybe doing some refunds. So we settled. And then when we settled, everybody started settling. And we all settled. We all agreed to roll back our millage and personal and real. And there was a complex formula back then. You temporarily roll back your personal, and it would go up a little. It was very complex. It was complex. But anyway, we rolled back. And then it was up to the court or the governing bodies of the other political entities whether or not they were going to raise their millages back up after it was rolled back. And we rolled back. We had a refund process, and oh gosh, it was chaotic. You know, we put together a good team to do it, but it was quite chaotic. The courthouse was swarmed by people wanting to fill out their forms for refunds, and that had to be done. They all had to be calculated. The collector would then pay them out, and the taxing entities would then reimburse the county. And I don't remember how much we refunded. We had to do some refunds. It wasn't a horrible amount. We had much more reserves back in those days. It wasn't a huge amount. We had to pay some attorney's fees, which came out of the refunds. We had to do some refunds. We rolled our millage back. The quorum court then ultimately raised the millage up a little bit. But that was a huge, gigantic lawsuit. And like I said, we decided to settle because of a Supreme Court decision that at the time that made us all think we were okay in prior years. We settled, and it did cost the county some money, but we recovered from it, and so did everybody else.
Without getting too detailed, what's the essence of the case? Wasn't there a limit, like it couldn't go up over 10%?
As I recall, it couldn't go up over, if it went up over 10%, then you had to do a test for rollback. And of course, we weren't doing the test. The assessor wasn't doing the test based on what the AG was saying. So we had to test for rollback. And if you went up over 10%, then you had to do a test. And it was complicated. The amendment was worded very complicated, and figuring it all out. They had what was called an assessment coordination division in Little Rock, who they had to beef up their staff to help all the assessors in the county. And so if it went up over 10%, then you had to test to see if you're going to roll back. And my memory is pretty hazy on Amendment 59 because we thought it had all gone away, but it didn't with Amendment 79. We still had to test for rollback. Even after the real estate collapse, we had to test for rollback. It ended up we didn't have to roll back. We might have had to roll back just a very small amount. So if it went up over 10%, then you had to test, do some sort of test. It was a mathematical formula. And you could either roll back, or you could take what was then called to as newly discovered property, newly created property. In other words, property that was newly subdivided. Or things like that. You had a choice of rolling back or taking your what was called newly discovered property. And we did have to roll back the one in the lawsuit, and I think we had to do some minor rollbacks in other years. Everybody thought when Amendment 79, which put lids on valuation, it was gone, but it wasn't. Leanne Kazara was the assessor by then. She said, no, I don't think it's gone, and it wasn't. Even after the crash, we had some times where we got very close to having to roll back, or maybe we had to roll back in a minor amount.
Talk about your plaintiffs and attorneys in that case. Wasn't it Dale Evans?
Dale Evans and Ken Hirsch were the attorneys in the rollback case. And there were two plaintiffs. Mays, there was Mays Body Shop here in Fayetteville, and I can't remember his name. He was the plaintiff, and there was another plaintiff. Each one had they represented a different taxpayer. And the suits got consolidated. Hicks, somebody by the name of Hicks. Those cases got consolidated. So a plaintiff, a Mays, and a man, I think it was another gentleman by the name of Hicks, it could have been a woman, were the taxpayer plaintiffs in those cases.
What are some of the other big issues or cases that you dealt with as county attorney?
Well, of course, I think I've already spoken about the ambulance wars under Charlie Johnson. We also had a big incinerator debacle during Charlie Johnson. Washington County and West Fork were part of the Incinerator Authority along with Fayetteville. Fayetteville, of course, dominated. It had the most membership on there. We appointed a couple of people, and West Fork did. It became very controversial. And they decided to relocate. The first incinerator was located, trash incinerator was located out by Happy Hollow School. The school district decided to move it. And once that happened, I said, uh-oh, because any other place they cited it, people started having concerns. Fayetteville decided, because they had the vast majority of seats on the authority, to basically to call the deal off and default on the bonds. So that was, we were very minor, the county and West Fork were very minor players in that. Fayetteville underwrote even, they guaranteed not only their own bonds, they guaranteed the county's portion of the bonds and city of West Forks. And so they defaulted on the bonds. The bonds were insured, so bondholders were made whole, and Fayetteville ended up eating quite a bit on that. They held a non-binding referendum, and the referendum not only passed, but Fayetteville also had an election to change their form of government over it.
What about the big property rights issue that was part of one of the ones that Charles A.G. and others were pushing Don Bright, they were trying to change the county from Democrat to Republican. Do you remember any of that?
Well, you know, I remember Don Bright and the guy that was head of the militia coming. Anytime the county talked about any kind of regulation out in the county, we had an old automobile junkyard ordinance. It had been on the books for a long time, even before I was county attorney, I think, that we enforced. And we had a person who enforced those. We didn't get much pushback on that. Most people were for that because we got a lot of complaints, about junkyards and automobile graveyards and what to do about them. There had been some. I'm trying to think of what other ordinances we considered. We did have some pushback. Under Jerry in particular, I remember we looked at, I think, the possibility of building permits out in the county. That didn't go over well and that didn't pass. But surprisingly, when Jerry Hunt was county judge, zoning passed in Washington County. And I remember working very hard on a zoning ordinance. H.L. Goodwin was Republican JP from Springdale, was a big proponent of it. Working and drafting an ordinance, that I thought, could pass, trying to make it. And it was ended up being a very simple ordinance. And there was a lot of outcry, particularly from the property rights people, like Don Bright and the militia people coming in, not happy about it. And one night, the Fayetteville JPs were for it. The Springdale city JPs were for it. The Republican and I think the Democrat JPs were, the Republican JPs, rural JPs were definitely against it, and I think the rural JPs may have been kind of split on it. And lo and behold, one night, the Quorum Court passed it on a one reading. They finally passed it on an emergency basis, or a one reading. We suspended the rules, read it 3 times, and got it passed. Well, they ended up passing it with 9 votes. I think it was an emergency ordinance. And I was stunned that happened, that it passed. And it was the Fayetteville JPs who were all, it was the city JPs in Fayetteville and Springdale who passed it. And it was implemented really with little fanfare. The thing that was driving it at the time, Washington County was just booming. And out in the county, you couldn't have these dense subdivisions because of the rules on septic tanks. You had to have at least an acre. So when you had a subdivision out in the county, they weren't these dense subdivisions. They usually had 1 or 2 acres. Well, a new type of sewage system had been developed. They were using a lot on the East Coast and the West Coast, called decentralized sewer systems, and were coming in, and they allowed for more dense development. They were untested in Arkansas, and people were afraid of them, of what they could do. They didn't like the dense development out in the county, and they're also afraid of what these things could do if they malfunction, what would happen to their drinking water, their well water. So that's what drove county zoning. It wasn't the dirt pits and the quarries and stuff. They came up later, but we weren't thinking about them at the time. We were thinking about these dense real estate developments. And so the zoning passed, and it was passed where out in the county there was a default zone for the county. It was either rural agricultural, which came in with no question. You could put nothing on, really no restrictions on agricultural facilities, and then it was residential, at least 1 acre. Now, but you could get conditional use permits that could allow you to vary particularly on the residential side. We didn't really think about what later on became huge issues under Jerry and under Marilyn Ward, dirt pits and quarries. We approved one, and the planning board did, big red dirt pit. Then it went to the quorum court, they approved it, and it got appealed to the Arkansas Court of Appeals. I represented the county, and Jim Crouch, an attorney in Springdale, represented the property owners who were objecting to this dirt pit, which was going to turn into a quarry at some time too. And the owner of the dirt pit had a lawyer out of Little Rock. And the appeal landed in front of Mark Lindsay, one of our, they were all circuit judges by then. And he ruled, usually when you take an appeal from the county, a decision of the county or the city, you get a brand new trial, what they call a trial de novo, and you have a right to a jury. Well, based on an earlier Supreme Court ruling, Judge Lindsay ruled, and he ended up being correct, that no, not on zoning matters. What was essentially a rezoning. You don't get a trial de novo. You don't get a jury trial. Then there's all these presumptions in favor of what the quorum court did, what the legislative body did, in favor of its legality, constitutionality, whether it was erroneous or not. There are always presumptions. That went up to the Arkansas Court of Appeals, and they won. The property owners won, the county won, on the issue that, and how they looked at our case, we didn't think of it at the time. The conditional use permit, they said it's essentially a rezoning. And that's a legislative act. And you don't get a trial de novo, you don't get a new jury, there's all these presumptions in favor of the legislative body, okay, it's the quorum court. And so, well, that ended up, so they upheld the granting of the conditional use permit for the dirt pit. There was another one that was also pending, and they were waiting. They put a stay on that case, waiting to see what the Supreme Court, and they dropped their case because the quorum court had ruled against that. The Rogers were putting in a quarry, I think, and the quorum court ruled against that one, and they waited. They had put a stay on their case, so it wasn't going to be heard until the Court of Appeals won that, and they ended up dropping their case.
Let's talk about the different places. You've talked about who you worked for, the prosecutor and the judges and stuff, but talk about the locations. Where all did you physically work when you were at the courthouse?
Well, of course, before I was full-time, when I started out, as a deputy prosecutor, the deputy prosecuting attorney was in a little building next door to the old courthouse, in the old American Legion hut. That's where the prosecuting attorney was, and that's where our office was. The courthouse was here in the old courthouse. And so if I needed, and we had the quorum court meetings, trying to remember, I don't remember us having any in this old building. We owned the building across the street, and we had a quorum courtroom over there. That's where we had a courtroom, quorum courtroom, and the law library was over in that old building. And so I would come over here, and I back in those days, all the lawyers were located here on Center Street. So I was always had my private practice somewhere on Center Street, and I just walked to the courthouse like we all did in those days, and came in, would meet with Charlie and Roger, or meet with any other elected official who had a question or needed me for something. And then we bought the new courthouse, the current courthouse, in the late 80s after the savings and loans debacle. We bought it from the Resolution Trust Company, which was a company set up by the federal government. And we bought it for some, but we did have to issue bonds, so I had to draw up the election. I had to draw up the ordinance and the ballot, for us to issue bonds to buy the new courthouse. And at the same time, we were going to build a new juvenile detention center And there was one other thing. I think we built also a new there was one other building, and it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember what it is right now. We built a new something else too. We issued bonds, and what we did was we issued bonds. We put up, the voters voted in a temporary tax. I can't remember how much it was. Maybe it was a half cent, quarter cent, to purchase that building and do some renovation on it, to build a new juvenile detention center, and to build a new, and I can't think what the other building was. It was maybe extension office, I think. Built a new extension office, which was a great buy. You know, and of course, this building at the time was just getting old and falling apart, and never did we think we could make it useful again for modern day, what you needed modern day in terms of wiring and so on and so forth. So we bought that building in the late 80s, and then when I became full-time, I had an office over at the, well, I still refer to it as the new courthouse.
What other stories do you have that you remember during your time in office that you might want to share? Stuff that I haven't thought to ask about.
Right. Well, you know, when Marilyn Edwards was elected in 2008, took office in January 2009, it's the year we had the ice storm. Came in February, the infamous ice storm. And oh my gosh, what a cataclysm it was. And of course, county government kind of went to, you know, came to a grinding halt. Power lines were down everywhere. Trees were down everywhere. We had to move the operations of the county down to the new road department. The road department south of town, what we now call South Campus, which is where the road department was, which where juvenile detention center is, where the jail is, and when it was new, and where some other offices were. So they had to move operations down there, and the courthouse was. They were without power for quite some time, and it got, not only with an ice storm, but it got bitter cold. I mean, we had no power at home. We had to go stay in a hotel. There was no power. There was power because there was a generator down there at the road department, so that's where county government went to function as much as it could. And of course, it was an emergency. Not only needed power restored, but you know, the road department had to get out and clear trees off of the roads. Everything was just, you know, everything was frozen solid, and that was quite an event. You know, quite an event, not only for county government, but for the people who lived in northwest Arkansas. Hope never live to see another one. A lot of people put in generators at their house after that.
What about some of the other county officials that you worked with?
Well,
to know.
Yeah, I worked for 3 sheriffs. And of course, I had to represent the sheriff on a variety of matters, which was Kenneth McKee, Bud Dennis, Steve Whitman, and of course, and our current sheriff, Tim Helder. They were all good sheriffs. McKee was the last of the old-time Arkansas sheriff that you normally think of in Arkansas now. From then on, we had Steve Whitmill and Tim Helder, the last of the old-time sheriffs. McKee was a colorful figure. I think I may have mentioned once where there was kind of an uprising in the sheriff's office. McKee decided to run for another term when everybody thought he wasn't going to, and several of the deputies said, "We're going to support Steve Whitmill," and he fired them all. Well, I was out of town. He didn't consult me. I was out of town. I was in Little Rock, and I think I read it in the paper, and I came back to it. I said, "Sheriff, we need to talk. You know, you can't do this. You know, you can't fire people based on their, you know, political views." And our risk management council, Rainwater and Associates, got involved in it too, and we convinced the sheriff, "You're going to have to hire these people back." He lost that election to Steve Whitmill, and but he was colorful. Kenneth McKee was very colorful because he was pretty old school. You know, we had banned smoking, you know, in the county buildings. McKee still lit up, smoked his cigarettes. Didn't faze him one bit, you know. But he was a good sheriff, as was Bud Dennis. He was a great sheriff, and as Whitmill and Helder still are. We had trying to think. Joanne Perry was the treasurer, and Joanne had been around a long time. Joanne is no longer with us, but she was very funny. I remember one time, and I don't know if I was a prosecutor or a county attorney. One time there was somebody being sentenced to prison up in the old courthouse, and the guy escaped from the courtroom, ran out of the courtroom, ran down the stairs. Joanne Perry's office, we were on the first floor. She tackled him. She saw him run, she tackled the guy. He was in an orange jumpsuit, and she tackled him before the sheriff's deputy could get to him. But Joanne was funny because she always, this was before we didn't have a comptroller at the time. Joanne, she always kind of had, she didn't do anything illegal, but if you coached her, she would know where some money was cubbyholed somewhere that could be used for something. Of course, the treasurer operates on a cash basis as opposed to the comptroller as more of an accounting accrual basis. But Joanne always, knew where some extra money was tucked away that maybe even the county judge didn't realize in the quorum court. And Joanne, was great. And very colorful. Alma Kohlmeyer was the circuit clerk. Alma got sued. Trying to think what she got sued over. One lawsuit was before my time. The county had required something to be put on all deeds, and Alma required it, and she got sued, and I think that lawsuit was won. She may have gotten sued a time or two on another thing, but I can't remember. I can't remember the lawsuit, but Alma was, Alma and the other women that were the deputy time had all seemed like they had been there forever. It seemed like, as long as I can remember. Since I'd been practicing law and here in Washington County, they had all been there. Alma Kohlmeyer, Joanne Perry, Joanne was treasurer, Bud was sheriff.
What about Roger Haney?
Roger was the assistant to the county judge, the position we now call chief of staff. And Roger was very, Roger was really he was a details guy. Roger was a great guy, great person to work for, and a very detailed person. He was on top of the budget, and also he was on top of all issues that Charlie would like, 911, the ambulance wars, choosing CEMS as the provider for 911. Roger was a great guy, and then Roger, when Charlie retired, Joanne was, and he announced Joanne Perry announced her retirement, and then Roger announced for the treasurer's position, which he held for, I'm not sure how many terms. He was there for quite a while as treasurer.
Anyone else you can think of?
Well, and my mind is going back right now. I'm thinking who the different elected officials were with sheriff, county judge, circuit clerk. Marilyn was the county clerk at the time, and I was a deputy. And I remember she came over and asked for some legal opinions. One, we had just started a comptroller. We had, the legislature authorized to have a comptroller. And it took some duties away from the county clerk. And she was not real clear in terms of what her duties were and what they weren't. Marilyn, she kind of kept the books for the county. It's kind of one of the things as county clerk she did, and not the treasurer. The treasurer strictly dealt with cash and telling us how much cash we had, and also dispersing. Because since we collected money, for all taxing entities, the collector and the treasurer would disperse money to the cities, tax money to the cities and school districts and whatnot. Marilyn came over and she asked for an opinion. And I gave her an opinion at the time, said, well, this is what you still have to do. You no longer have to do A, B, C, and D. Well, then she came back and she asked him for an opinion. And he said the same thing. So then we found out we got an AG's opinion, because it was a kind of a sea change for the county clerk's office, you know, to no longer be involved in things like payroll. And she was involved in payroll and keeping the county's checkbook, more or less. And Marilyn was very professional. She was feisty. She was feisty. I used to tease her because she had red hair back then, and I said her red hair would show every now and then, you know. She was feisty. And then, you know, after she retired, she went to the legislature and worked in the legislature for a while, and then decided to run when Jerry Hunt announced that he was retiring. Became the first female county judge in Washington County, if not the whole state. I think there may have been one other who took her husband's position, was appointed to take her husband's position when he died.
Let's see. If somebody came to you and they didn't know anything about Washington County and they said, hey, what can you tell me about your county of Washington County? What's it like? What would you tell them?
What if I tell them now, you know, well, for one, you know, of course it is, the growth has just been unbelievable. You know, the growth here has just been unbelievable. You can tell you're getting old when you, like I long for the good old days, as I long for the Fayetteville of the 90s. All the lawyers knew each other. In Washington County and Benton County, it's a very, even in the country, there's not as much country. There is country out there and there is farming out there, but it's become a very urban county. You know, the Fayetteville, Springdale, Rogers, Bentonville area now is over 500,000 people. It's become a very urban center. It's still a great place to live. I think the only place I'd want to live if I was going to live in Arkansas, you know. But I thought it was great when we moved here. I remember going back and looking, and I thought to my wife, oh my God, the population of Fayetteville when we moved here was 30,000. And now it's 79,000, or maybe a little over 80 now, with the whole metro area being 500,000. So it's a great place to live. It's a great quality of life. It's a big, small town. But it's gotten bigger than I would prefer. And my mother, who's still alive and lives here, she doesn't like it either. You know, she likes it back, you know, in the 90s too. You know, but that's how it gets to be when you get older. Nostalgia and thinking the old days were better.
When you were leaving as the county attorney before you became chief of staff, what were the challenges facing that office? I mean, if you had to tell the next guy coming in,
right,
what are challenges? What were they?
Let's see what was going on at that time. Really, you know, I'm trying to think didn't seem like there were a lot of major issues going. There some major issues developed after I left. Didn't seem like there were any major issues going on when I left. I did have to, because Steve Zaga had been a JP at one time for several years, and he had been a JP when zoning was initiated, and I kind of had to school him on not just some of the more obvious things, but some of the lesser things that are not obvious. A lot of things that the county judge or the county attorney did, and what our position was on certain matters. We didn't have there was a beginning of a divide on the quorum court and the county judge, Marilyn. And it wasn't necessarily Republican. It was some Democrats. It became a very divisive relationship. And I had to warn him about that, tell him, you know, I don't know how much became obviously later on in the public that there was a big rift. But, you know, that situation had to be handled with kid gloves, because you're the county attorney. You also represent the quorum court and give the quorum court members advice. And so that was a situation that had to be handled with kid gloves. It wasn't a political partisan issue. It was a political issue, but it wasn't a partisan issue.
One thing that I've noticed, George, over the years is you always kind of had a reputation and maybe an MO of staying above the partisan fray and not trying to give policy advice, but to strictly give legal advice. And for many attorneys, public attorneys, that's not the case.
Yeah, so you can get sucked in, and everybody wants to suck you in on policy. And I'd always have to stop and say, no, that's a policy issue. You know, all I can tell you is what's legal and what's constitutional and what's not. Whether or not you choose to adopt a certain policy, be it zoning, for instance. You know, I had to, some of the more conservative JPs didn't like zoning at all. Thought it was illegal, unconstitutional, taking a property without due process, and I had to, well, according to the courts, no, it's not. And I'm a lawyer, I'm a trained lawyer. I've looked at the cases. I've looked at cases involving ordinances very similar to ours, and it's legal, it's constitutional. You have the authority to do it. Now, whether you do it or not, and whether you think it's good policy or not, is not up to me. I don't have an opinion on that. I may have secretly had an opinion, but I tried to never express it. Some of them, there were a couple of the real conservative old JPs would get mad when a JP would propose something, and I would say, well, I'm sorry, that's not, that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. And I think one JP, and I can't remember sure who it was, actually wanted to introduce an ordinance that would keep me from giving an opinion on whether or not something was unconstitutional or not. And that didn't go anywhere, But, but yeah, you had to watch as a public attorney, representative of getting pulled into politics. Because there's a tendency to want to suck you in and be on their side, And I tried my best to stay above the fray. And for the most part, I think I did a pretty good job. There weren't any elected officials that I got crosswise with, but there were some JPs who I didn't get along with that well. And that got worse when I came back as chief of staff because I was in a totally different position then.
One last question for you here. If you had to finish this sentence, and some of this you probably have already talked about, but my favorite thing about Washington County is, how would you state that sentence?
Quality of life. I think we've got a great quality of life in Washington County. Particularly, I was born and raised in the Delta. My wife is born and raised down in South Arkansas. And having gone back there over the years, our folks are, just my mother lives up here now. My father and all my brothers, nobody lives over in the Delta anymore. And my wife's still got a sister in South Arkansas. And still now when I do work with legal aid, and I still talk with people from southern or eastern Arkansas, and I know how good we have it up here. The economy over there is dismal. The poverty rate is just is terrible. The public schools are in a mess. Sometimes we don't realize how good we have it in Northwest Arkansas.